Hey everyone, I'm Jack.
And I'm Alex, minus all 4 of my wisdom teeth as of yesterday.
And today we'll be ranking the bosses of Cuphead's brand new DLC, The Delicious Last Course, from worst to best. As initially put by Studio MDHR in early 2018, serving up a free-range, locally sourced, artisanal meal like this one takes some time, so The Delicious Last Course will be in the oven until 2019. 4 years onwards, and here we are. Cuphead's DLC has finally arrived after being presumed in permanent limbo, an oddly similar pre-launch route to Elden Ring, and lands as one of the great gaming add-ons in the history of post-launch content, due mainly to its 5-year development period. While the DLC was, and still is, ripped apart for being so slowly crafted, the debatably ridiculous amount of time spent creating it is an important lesson so commonly overlooked by the masses within the gaming industry. That being enforced timetables, which in famous cases such as Dark Souls or Knights of the Old Republic 2 leads to rushed designs and overall lower quality products, usually an issue with larger AAA corporations rather than smaller studios such as MDHR. However, as with so many great titles and editions of the past, the more time spent basing, the higher quality the production when finished.
Studio MDHR's The Delicious Last Course DLC manages to introduce some of the most extravagant, engaging, and eye-popping fights we've seen yet, not to mention adding Miss Chalice and a broad spectrum of freshly created weapons and charms as well. Seeing as there's only 8 bosses, this video will be on the shorter side, but if you'd like to see us rank these fights based on difficulty, quality on expert, difficulty on expert, whatever, let us know in the comments. With that said, let's return to Inkwell Isle.
In preparation for The Delicious Last Course, I stayed up until 3 in the morning the day of release grinding out some of the most abysmal fights from the main game on Expert. Like Bruce Wayne in The Dark Knight Rises, I rebirthed myself from a long-forgotten hero of old into a newfound champion of the two-dimensional boss rush genre in a matter of hours, even earning an S rank on Cala-fucking-Maria. You're likely asking, why would you suffer through hours of rumor honeybottoms instead of enjoying your time with, say, Werner Vermin? Well, it's practically inevitable that at least one fight in any game or DLC, no matter how small the boss count, is going to be fairly bad. Enter the Devil and Angel, easily one of, if not the worst gimmick fight in the base game or DLC. To preface the rest of the video, Alex played the entire DLC as Miss Chalice while I played as Cuphead for the sake of variation. We're both very aware that Chalice is significantly better than Cuphead, however it makes for interesting comparison. Leading me to say the difference in fighting the Devil and Angel as either Chalice or Cuphead is 0 to none. Even before you fight, finding the boss itself is a semi-nuisance. You need to talk to 3 NPCs on the podium, and each gives directional clues as to which gravestone you need to hit in order of places 1, 2, and 3. Before doing the puzzle, it's required for you to have both purchased and equipped the broken relic. From there, interact with the prompted gravestones, and you unlock the secret. The fight space mechanic works similar to one you'd find in a Mario Galaxy game. There are 2 devils on either side of the arena, and depending on which side you face, that devil's attacks are potent, while the other turns into an angel and all of his attacks become impotent. Sounds simple enough on paper. Fair, but now insert a ray of fire working with the same mechanic alongside a floating central platform that can damage you. Whether you use charge, crack shot, roundabout, or any other shot for some reason, this fight boils down to a scramble for openings entirely luck dependent with minimal repetition or patterns involved. As by far the most irritating and simply bad fight in The Delicious Last Course, the Devil and Angel rightfully find themselves at the steep bottom of our ranking.
Longtime viewers may recall me harboring a burning hatred for the denizens of the casino. While the King's Gauntlet is similar in structure, it is vastly more enjoyable. The parrying-only mechanic opened up a lot of interesting routes to take on this array of chess-themed foes, and all of them are relatively enjoyable. The Knight is weirdly hard compared to the others in my opinion, but once you get him down, he's nothing absurdly unfair. The pawns are just hapless suicide bombers, which fits their role in actual chess pretty neatly. The Bishop is my personal favorite. He took me a little bit to figure out, but definitely has my favorite gimmick of the lot. The Rook is pretty easy, but I like the whole executioner garb they designed for him, and the head juggling was amusing. Lastly, the Queen with the cannons was fun and not too incredibly difficult. This gets 7th place because it's far less crazy, difficult, and out there than the main bosses, but it's not a poor showing by any means.
At number 6, we have ourselves Glumstone the Giant, the first main DLC fight and one of the more frustrating bosses in the entirety of Cuphead to top. Similar to the Devil and Angel, whether you play as Cuphead or Miss Chalice makes little to no difference with the gameplay itself. Also, couldn't they have made the entrance to this like a bit obvious? I had a harder time finding this than a secret puzzle boss. Anyways, the first phase is extremely clustered, with constant attacks coming from Glumstone, the sky, the platforms, even the ground itself. This alone made me angrier than I've been since my Batman LARP phase around 2 years ago, with there being little reprieve throughout, a constant barrage of attacks from every angle that, in certain cases, makes it simply not possible to avoid damage. We got a lot of shtick in our last Cuphead video for saying that exact same thing, but I'm holding strong that this is impossible to come out of. Does this example of poor design mean Glumstone is a bad boss? Well, not necessarily. When luck is on your side and you position yourself well enough, the first phase is manageable and even slightly fun. The geese attack specifically is extremely luck dependent, although given the right scenario you can smoke dash to another platform and remain ducked below it. However, it's when you get a mixture of ground gnomes, the magic potion, and the hammer gnome that shit hits the fan rather quickly. Individually, these three are well made and fair, however, when combined, the gameplay feels extremely sporadic and overwhelming. Eventually, you'll deal enough damage to move on to phase 2, beginning with Glumstone losing his beard. He looks like Joe Thornton, it's really off-putting. Nonetheless, puppets of King Dice and the Devil toss a ball back and forth while minuscule creatures of some toy I can't make out pop up from the ground. As long as you're not stationary and rather consistently move from one end of the room to the other, you'll probably take no damage at all. The little balls only jump to where you were when they originally leapt from the ground, while the puppets ignore you altogether. After you take out the puppets, Glumstone literally eats you and you fight his stomach to finish him off like an episode of Courage the Cowardly Dog or something. This phase is weirdly easy, but I struggle with nerves and had been fighting Glumstone for about 35 minutes when I first made it here, so I died. Then again. The floor is lava, or rather acid, and you stand on the bone platforms to avoid damage. His stomach shoots out pits of bone and meat that open up the platforms, meaning you have to constantly switch positions, although sometimes a parry opening will make it so you can automatically reset a platform. I recommend saving your super for this phase, as the second is much easier and less strenuous in terms of saving yourself from damage. Either way, with enough reps you should be fine taking down the giant and likely gathering all the ingredients so you can re-enter the chef's bakery.
Surprise, the kindly chef is a serial killer. I think a lot of us predicted that this guy would wind up being an asshole when the trailer came out, and right we were. My lack of surprise disregarded, Chef Saltbaker is quite a finale. They did a great job making him seem menacing with all the animations in his first phase, like butchering the poor dough and squeezing the strawberries out of that other guy. It's probably the second most macabre thing added with the DLC, right behind Esther getting ground up and turned into sausage by her own vacuum. More on that later. This phase is definitely the most insane, even though it's the first one. There's an ungodly amount of shit flying around, and I was having to use my peripheral vision to keep track of half the projectiles. It's a good thing I got my teeth ripped out yesterday and not today, because I really don't think I could have done this while tranked off the Joker gas. The second phase is interesting in that to damage him you gotta blast these pepper shakers his way, which is a sneaky way of making your super attack virtually useless and ensuring you don't nuke him too fast. This phase is not that hard, so it's not a big handicap in the grand scheme of things, but I enjoyed watching him slowly crack over time. There's a third phase I never stuck around to mess around with and always just nuked off the bat, but it looked like some kind of dancing salt guy. The finale is cool. I like that they brought the parry to deal damage feature over here from the chess guys, which is another reason that I'd say using Miss Chalice is the most fun way to play the game now. They clearly designed the DLC around her with all the vertical arenas and such, and the parry dash makes this phase a lot more manageable in my opinion. While not even cracking the top half of our list, keep in mind that if I were to rank him amongst the main game bosses, he'd still be in my top 10.
The Moonlight Mob opens up the DLC in trademark Cuphead style, featuring some of the best thematic work across the series so far, while also being equally entertaining in terms of gameplay variation. While it's a fairly easy boss fight, the mob features massive variety within each phase alongside fun and learnable mechanics that makes beating the fight very satisfying. The first phase is the most formidable on paper. The spider mobster is able to move among all three floors, so it's optimal you stay in the middle. However, this is countered by 1. Web bombs that explode upon impact, and 2. Summoned bugs that force you to move about. I always find it best when a boss counters shortcuts intentionally rather than spam or otherwise uninventive mechanics, and this is one of the best examples of this in Cuphead in general. By contrast, the second phase is fairly subjective in terms of how you approach it. Personally, I stuck to the left side of the room, and depending on which triad ignited, I'd either drop down and smoke dash across, or jump up and walk to the right side, then invert the strategy. It's also helpful that the Lady Ant has a very small health pool, as bosses with multiple phases are always best off having their most repetitive ones be the shortest as well. With all of that build up, surely a banging closer could really bring the Moonlight Mob home and nail it down as one of the greats in the game. As I said a while back, Cuphead was my main character and Charge was my main, and in turn the Anteater was a fucking nightmare. By comparison, with Crackshot as my main and Charge as my secondary to get rid of the spitballs, this phase goes by pretty swiftly and is actually quite fun. Although without Crackshot, it is ridiculously hard to get any form of damage, although playing as Chalice makes the parrying aspect of it a bit more practical. While usually I think it's indicative of bad design when a boss fight is made to be beaten around a specific playstyle, in this case I think it's fair seeing as it's a new boss making use of new mechanics, as compared to, say, the bosses of Elden Ring, of which are simply too fast for a strength build to work as compared to Dex or Magic. The Moonlight Mob is a fairly relaxing yet still engaging challenge to kick off the DLC, and even with it being trivial, finds itself on the positive half of the delicious Last Course's bosses.
I wasn't expecting to be a huge fan of this one initially, but the sheer volume of neat mechanics it brought into the mix won me over. Standing on that dude's airplane took a bit to get used to, but was more intuitive than I'd have guessed, and visually this is one of my favorites by far. The first phase isn't too brutal once you get the hang of the new plane walking gimmick, and the second one is a joke with Charge, but the third phase is the big kahuna here. It's my second favorite phase in the whole DLC animation-wise behind Mortimer's second phase. Big fan of the massive dog ship and lasers and stuff. Never thought I'd see steampunk meets rubber hose style, but here we are. The screen turning thing was fun since I found all these weird ways of circumventing it, like tilting my head 90 degrees and flipping my controller around and stuff, but it's still tricky no matter what. It's also got a secret phase if you bring all the jetpack dogs to low health, but don't actually kill any of them. Who doesn't love the secret phases? The Howling Aces were an underdog contender at first, but are definitely one of my favorites now looking back.
As my personal number 1, Esther Winchester is the ultimatum of plain gameplay, a mechanic perfected through a single boss that makes for one of the best fights of this decade so far. Esther takes and improves upon the mechanical mistakes of the plain bosses of old while also reverbing entire fights, namely bullet hells. Across the board, the flying fights fly under the radar, no pun intended, among the community, Jimmy aside, and even those I find to be sort of bad I still enjoy because the gameplay is so unique. Similar to the Moonlight Mob, this fight is extremely overwhelming, and dissecting it to the point of simplicity made for one of the best experiences I've ever had with a boss fight. Specifically the first phase, there is so much happening on the top and bottom of the screen, but as with most flying bosses, just paying attention to Cuphead alone rather than the grand picture makes it well easier. As long as you stay centered between the ink birds and are aware of the cacti bird, you barely have to move. The majority of the time can be spent shooting at Esther, and I actually recommend following him, or her, or whatever, to whichever floor it goes to, otherwise you'll likely die. As with most of the DLC bosses, there is a strategy to save your super for specific phases. While the reverse bullet hell isn't intrinsically hard, the second part of this attack is, and going into super during it means you'll only have to face it once. Leading into phase 3, while I complained, and still complain en masse about how obnoxious spam and patchy gameplay is with base Cuphead, flying sequences where I can barely tell what's happening bring me obscene amounts of joy. This is like Calamaria's phase, but significantly better without the freeze mechanic, and like the first phase, I'd recommend saving your super for the finale. A can of beef sausages. While maybe fit for a combat item in Paper Mario Sticker Star, Studio MDHR somehow made a can of beefcakes one of the most engaging phases in the Cuphead boss lineup so far. Unlike the preceding Frank, this is a static fight where an infinite stream of sausages with small openings to escape through run up and down the arena. The can itself also shoots out peppers, usually at least one is parryable, and should you get 2 supers, this phase should be done and dusted. Admittedly, I had a very hard time no damaging this phase, however I had so much enjoyment from it that I never found myself aggravated or anything close to angry for that matter. Esther Winchester was by far the most memorable, best looking, and most thematically pleasing of all. Through exceptional gameplay and extremely variational phase changes, he or she, or whatever, gets the #1 spot in my book and the #2 on our list.
Mortimer Freeze is a really cool boss, both literally and colloquially. After getting every trophy in the DLC, I then set my sights on S-ranking every boss, and let me say, dear lord was this one of the hardest. Mortimer's first phase isn't anything too amazing, and mostly just annoys me by never giving me parryable cards more than anything else. The real fun begins in phase 2, which takes about 15 seconds to get to anyways. His snowman form is my favorite boss design in the game and has a ton of amazingly animated moves to get the hang of. This phase is also enormously difficult, and mastering it is no easy feat. The Popsicle guys have a habit of showing up at the worst possible time in the worst possible area, but it's never totally unavoidable if you're on your A game. The final phase is also neat. It reminds me a bit of Grim Matchstick gameplay-wise, who I also happen to love. The eyeball move is probably the hardest one for me to handle, but the buckets can be a hassle if he decides to shoot them from below rather than above. I also want to give props to the boss arena here. This is my favorite one in the DLC as well. I dig the sun and moon iconography all over the walls. Reminds me a bit of the Spirit Temple from Ocarina of Time, but if it was frozen over. All in all, the best way to summarize my experience with Mortimer Freeze is that he was by far the most fun boss to master for me and the most visually appealing to boot.
Thank you so much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed not just this video, but the delicious last course as well. Be sure to check out our ranking of Cuphead's bosses in either the description or end screen, and otherwise be on the lookout for uploads every Wednesday, special occasions excluded. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't, and once again, thank you for watching. With all that said, deuces.